What if the only thing keeping a dying lion cub alive was a wild bobcat meant to live alone? In the heart of the Canadian wilderness, one desperate decision changed everything. Two predators, one built for the savanna, the other for stealth, were never meant to meet. But when survival demanded connection, something miraculous happened. This is the true story of a friendship that defied biology expectations and fate itself. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. If you enjoy the story, please like and follow. It helps us keep creating more. Your feedback means everything. Thank you. In the misty forests of British Columbia, nestled between towering pines and the hush of snow-dusted silence, stood the North Valley Wildlife Haven, a sanctuary for the injured, orphaned, and nearly forgotten. But no patient had troubled the staff quite like Atlas. At only 8 weeks old, the lion cub was a shadow of what he should have been. Curled in the farthest corner of his heated enclosure, his body seemed to fold in on itself, bones visible beneath his dull gold coat, ears, limp chest, rising with thin, shallow breaths. He refused food, ignored toys, and barely acknowledged the humans who watched him with growing helplessness. Dr. Helen Moore stood quietly at the glass wall, separating her from Atlas. A seasoned wildlife veterinarian, Helen had seen her share of fragile creatures, but this was different. "He's shutting down," she said softly, more to herself than to anyone in particular. Beside her, Claire Jensen, the animal care technician assigned to Atlas, nodded with a grim expression. "Third day he's barely touched his formula," Claire reported. "He won't even lift his head when I walk in anymore." Helen sighed, flipping through her clipboard. "I was afraid of this. It's not just the illness, it's the isolation. He's a social animal without a pride." The decision to remove Atlas from his family hadn't been made lightly. Born the runt of a litter of 4, Atlas struggled to compete for food and warmth. His siblings, healthy and robust, had unintentionally edged him out, and his mother, though caring, couldn't divide her attention enough to compensate. When he developed a respiratory infection, Helen made the call to bring him into intensive care. The infection cleared, but Atlas had been fading ever since. "Have we heard back from any of the other sanctuaries?" Claire asked. They had been searching desperately for another lion cub, any companion close in age. Helen shook her head. "Nothing. No matches. The next youngest we found is already 4 months, far too dominant." At that moment, the door opened with a soft creak. Warren Ellis stepped into the room, his weathered face unreadable. "I might have a long shot," he said, rubbing his gloved hands together. "Just got off the phone with June Redsky at the Cedar Ridge Sanctuary in Idaho. They've got a rescued bobcat cub, about 6 weeks old, lost his mother during a logging operation." Helen blinked. "A bobcat?" I know," Warren said quickly. "It's unorthodox, but remember that cheetah and Anatolian shepherd pair at San Diego. It's not impossible. They're both felines, both social at this age, and both completely alone. The size difference will be dramatic," Claire pointed out. "Yes, eventually," Warren agreed. "But for now they're both tiny, both in need. The bobcat's name is Bram. He's healthy, but needs socialization." Helen hesitated, then turned back toward Atlas, who lay unmoving on the warming pad. His eyes were open, but there was no spark in them, only a deep, familiar sadness. "How soon can Bram get here?" she asked. "Tomorrow evening," Warren replied. "They're prepping now." By nightfall the following day, a transport van rolled up the icy road to the Haven's service entrance. Inside a secured crate, Bram paced in restless circles, spotted bright-eyed and clearly unhappy with the long drive. June Redsky handed over his health records and offered a soft smile. "He's a tough one," she said, "but he needs this as much as your cub does." The room adjacent to Atlas's enclosure had been prepared warm lighting, soft bedding, and a window through which the two cubs could see one another but not yet interact. As Bram stepped cautiously out of the crate, Helen and Claire stood in silence. At first, he only sniffed his surroundings. Then, perhaps drawn by instinct, he turned toward the glass and froze. In the next room, Atlas had finally lifted his head. For the first time in days, his eyes locked onto something. Someone. It was only a moment. But for the team who had been bracing for the worst, it felt like the first breath after drowning. The next morning, the sanctuary was unusually quiet. Snow had fallen lightly overnight, dusting the pine branches and blanketing the outer enclosures in a soft hush. Inside the observation wing, Bram, still in quarantine, was wide awake. The Bobcat kitten moved with cautious curiosity, tracing the perimeter of his new space with soft paws, pausing often to sniff the air or test the texture of the bedding beneath him. On the other side of the glass, Atlas watched. It wasn't much, just the slow shift of his head as Bram passed by the flick of one ear in response to a rustling sound, but to Helen and Claire, it was enough to stir a cautious optimism. "He's tracking." Claire whispered, eyes fixed on the lion cub. "He hasn't done that since he got here." Helen nodded. "We'll keep them separated for now, but allow full visual access. Let's see what unfolds." For the next 2 days, that window became the axis of Atlas's world. He never approached it with urgency, but his gaze was drawn to it again and again. Bram, though initially wary, seemed to mirror the attention. He would occasionally press his nose to the glass ear's forward tail, flicking with what looked like tentative excitement. The two cub species apart, yet so strangely attuned, began a quiet wordless dialogue through glass. That was the plan, at least. On the third morning, Helen arrived at the sanctuary to find Claire waiting by the staff entrance, a mix of disbelief and something like amusement on her face. "You're going to want to see this," Claire said. As they entered the observation corridor, Helen stopped dead. Inside Atlas's enclosure, through the same reinforced window, 2 small bodies were curled together on the heated bed, side by side, as if they had always belonged that way. Bram. In his room, Helen blinked. "Security footage shows he slipped through a ventilation grate overnight," Claire explained. "We didn't think he could fit. We were wrong." Helen approached the glass heart pounding. Bram stirred slightly at her presence, but didn't move away. Atlas shifted too, eyes blinking open slowly. Not startled, just aware. "They've been like this since about 5 this morning," Claire said. "We debated separating them, but..." "Look at him." Helen did. Atlas's breathing had changed. It was deeper, less shallow. His coat, still patchy, had more color. Most telling of all was the calm on his face. Not the blank detachment of his earlier days, but something gentler, trusting. Warren joined them moments later, a travel mug steaming in his hand. "June says we should let it play out, carefully monitored." Helen exhaled. "I agree. But full observation protocol, 24 hours. Any sign of stress or aggression, we intervene." Over the following days, what unfolded was nothing short of extraordinary. Bram, the smaller of the two, seemed to take on the role of instigator. He would bat at Atlas's tail with light paws bound across the room in exaggerated hops, or perch atop a plush toy as if claiming territory. At first, Atlas only watched his responses slow and unsure. But then gradually, the lion cub began to engage. A swat of the paw, a nudge of the nose, a shuffle of movement toward the game. By the end of the week, Atlas was not only moving on his own, he was eating, not just nibbling, finishing bowls. And Wild Bram stood watch at every meal, sometimes licking the residue from Atlas's chin as if to say, "Good job." "They're co-regulating," Helen noted, scribbling on her tablet. "It's like one is anchoring the other." This shouldn't work, but it does. The staff quickly adapted, expanding the enclosure space, childproofing it from further unsanctioned escapes. But the heart of the room was the same two creatures, born for different worlds, wrapped in warmth, not from heat lamps, but from something far more fragile and far more powerful. Connection. Word travels fast in quiet places. By the end of the second week, Atlas and Bram's improbable friendship had become the most talked about phenomenon inside the North Valley Wildlife Haven. What began as a desperate experiment was now being referred to half-jokingly, half-awed as a miracle. But outside the walls of the sanctuary, the story had begun to ripple. It started with a single social media post. Claire had shared a photo, just a private update to her network of the two cubs, curled together, one golden one, spotted side by side beneath the warming lamp. Didn't expect this today, she had captioned it. Within 48 hours, it had been shared over 80,000 times. By day 5, it reached 2.3 million. News crews began to call. Wildlife magazines requested interviews. An online wildlife documentary channel wanted exclusive footage. Warren Ellis fielded inquiries from 3 continents and politely declined 2 offers to sponsor the cubs with branded plush toys. "We're not running a zoo," he told Helen flatly. "But I admit this could help. Donations are up 400% since the post went viral. We might actually be able to finish the new rehabilitation wing." Helen, however, kept her focus tight. "Only under our terms. Their welfare comes first." That week, the sanctuary welcomed a special visitor. Amara Thompson, an 8-year-old leukemia patient from Billings, had followed the story obsessively during her hospital stays. Through the Make-A-Wish Foundation, she asked for one thing: to see the 2 animals that had kept her smiling when chemo made everything else unbearable. The staff prepared carefully. Amara would observe from behind safety glass, no direct contact, but close enough to see them move, play, exist. She wore a bright pink beanie over her bald head and walked slowly, leaning slightly on her mother's arm. When she reached the window, Bram was mid-pounce, ambushing Atlas from behind a plush log. Atlas gave a surprised growl, more of a squeak really, and rolled into his friend with a mock bite. The room erupted in motion. But then Bram paused. He turned toward the glass. He looked straight at Amara. Then, without a sound, he walked to the window and sat. Moments later, Atlas followed. Together they pressed their faces near the glass, their breath fogging a small circle between them and the girl. Amara pressed her tiny hand to the glass. Atlas pressed his paw back. No one spoke. No one needed to. After that moment, Helen realized something had shifted. This wasn't just about conservation anymore. It was about hope. Back in her office, she reviewed their charts. Atlas was now eating 4 full meals a day. His weight had increased by 30%. His coat showed healthy sheen, and his play behavior was consistent with a normal lion cub. Bram was thriving too, alert, calm, socially engaged. The 2 animals had become each other's anchor. But not everyone was convinced. "He's a lion," argued Damien. A senior zoologist from Calgary, brought in for consultation. "He needs to learn lion behavior, dominance structures, vocal patterns, pride instincts. This bond with a bobcat is unnatural." Helen didn't flinch. So is survival after isolation. So is recovering trust after trauma. And yet, here we are. We have to think long-term. Eventually, you'll want to integrate him with other lions. And the bobcat. Helen paused. Bram was never meant to stay. But the bond is real. We won't break it prematurely. Damien frowned. "Then you're not thinking like a biologist." "No," she said calmly. "I'm thinking like a healer." That evening, the cubs curled together once again under the soft red glow of their heat lamp. Outside their enclosure, the forest wind moved through the trees like a whisper, carrying with it the echoes of a question no one could yet answer. What happens when one heart belongs to the wild and the other to the crown? But for now, they slept. And that was enough. Spring arrived quietly in British Columbia. The snow receded, revealing soft moss underfoot and sunlight that filtered through the canopy in longer, warmer rays. At the North Valley Wildlife Haven, the seasons weren't marked by calendars, but by the behavior of its animals. Atlas had changed. His legs, once unsteady, now carried him in bounding leaps. His golden coat shone with health, his muscles filling out with every week. The beginnings of a mane dusted the edges of his face soft, but unmistakably there. Bram had changed too. He still remained the smaller of the two, by far never exceeding 30 pounds, but his spirit had grown even more than his body. Confident, quick, and impossibly agile, he often led their games, darting up branches, pouncing from perches, always just a heartbeat ahead of Atlas. But with growth came decisions. "We have to start thinking about the next stage," Warren said, sitting across from Helen in her office. "He can't stay in juvenile care forever. We've had requests from 2 conservation centers willing to integrate Atlas into young pride programs." Helen stared at the file in front of her. "What about Bram?" "That's the hard part," Warren admitted. "He was never meant to be permanent. He's healthy, self-sufficient, and could still be a candidate for wild reintroduction." Helen didn't respond right away. Her mind was back in the observation room, watching Bram bat playfully at Atlas's ears until the lion rolled over with a growl of delight. The bond was still there, unmistakable. But so were the instincts, growing louder each day. A turning point came with the arrival of a new resident, Nahla, a 14-month-old lioness, transferred from a facility in Colorado due to overcrowding. She was strong, alert, and immediately curious about Atlas. They were housed in separate but adjoining enclosures with visual access standard procedure. Atlas was captivated. At first, he only watched. Then came the soft vocalizations, low rumbles in his chest. When Nahla responded with her own, even the staff stood still. "He's communicating," Claire noted with quiet awe. "That's the first time he's made that sound." Over the following days, Atlas began splitting his time. Mornings with Bram, playful, familiar, light-hearted. Afternoons near Nahla, more serious, cautious, but unmistakably drawn to the rhythm of his own kind. Helen observed carefully. "He's learning to be a lion, without losing what Bram gave him." The first supervised meeting between all 3 was tense. Nahla approached with confidence, Atlas with protective uncertainty, Bram with wary silence. But nothing went wrong. No snarls, no posturing. Only curious circling and occasional nose touches. They're building something new. June Redsky commented during her follow-up visit, "Not just adapting, blending." Still signs began to emerge. Bram sometimes withdrew to the higher shelves of the enclosure, watching rather than joining in. He no longer curled beside Atlas every night, sometimes choosing solitude instead. The staff watched this gradual shift with heavy hearts, but no surprise. They were growing apart the way siblings sometimes do, not from rejection, but from evolution. Then, one early morning, Claire found Bram waiting by the side gate of the enclosure, his body poised, ears forward, eyes calm. It was as if he knew. They opened the gate slowly, and Bram stepped out, not hesitating. He trotted toward the pine edge of the inner wild zone, paused once to glance back, just once, then vanished into the trees. Helen arrived moments later, breath caught in her throat. "Do we follow?" Claire asked softly. Helen shook her head. "Not yet. If he's ready, we owe him the choice." That evening, Atlas sat alone under the moonlight, quiet and still. Then, with a deep exhale, he rose, padded to the fence, and let out a single sound, a low rumbling call that echoed across the sanctuary. It was not a cry of loss. It was an acknowledgement. And somewhere in the trees, Bram heard it. Autumn arrived like a hush after a storm. The leaves turned amber and gold, and the mountain air thinned with the promise of the first frost. At the North Valley Wildlife Haven, preparations for winter began quietly, but in one corner of the sanctuary, something else stirred. Atlas was no longer a cub. Now nearly 2 years old, he was a lion in full adolescence, his frame broad, his mane darkening with each week. He had integrated fully into a structured pride unit within the sanctuary alongside Nahla and 2 other lionesses, introduced gradually. He learned the signs, the hierarchy, the language of his kind. And yet, every now and then, when the wind shifted or the shadows fell just right, he would turn toward the forest and listen. Because not everything had changed. There was still Bram. No longer a constant presence, the bobcat had made the outer forest his home. He roamed freely through the inner wild zones and often kept his distance. But the staff noticed something extraordinary at least once a week. Usually in the early mornings, Bram would return, never entering the main enclosure, but always pausing at the rock ridge just above Atlas's habitat, watching. Sometimes, if the conditions were right, Atlas would lift his head, and for a moment, the two would lock eyes across the invisible divide. No sound, no movement, just recognition. "We couldn't have scripted it better," Warren murmured during one such morning, binoculars in hand. "It's like they're each other's shadow," Helen replied. "Separate, but not gone." That fall, the Haven hosted its first major public event, Unlikely Friends. 2 years of healing. Photos, video footage, and journaled observations were presented as part of an education initiative on interspecies connection and trauma recovery. Donations from the viral story had helped fund an entire wing for critical care cubs, now officially named the Bram and Atlas Recovery Center. Amara Thompson, now in remission, returned to cut the ribbon. She smiled wide beneath her wool cap, holding the oversized scissors with both hands. "I told you they helped me heal," she said into the microphone. "And now they'll help others too." Inside the exhibit, visitors watched footage of Bram teaching Atlas to pounce, of Atlas nudging Bram toward shared meals, of their first night curled together beneath the red lamp. Many cried. Others simply stood in quiet awe. But out in the habitat, the celebration went unnoticed. That morning, Atlas lay on a sun-warmed slab of rock, his eyes half-lidded in comfort. Bram emerged from the trees silent as always, and moved to his usual spot on the ridge. But this time, something changed. Instead of staying at the edge, Bram descended. Slowly, deliberately. Staff held their breath. This hadn't happened in over 6 months. Atlas lifted his head. He didn't rise. He didn't move. He simply watched. Bram stepped forward, stopped just inside the enclosure fence, low enough for him to squeeze through, high enough to keep the others out. He paused. Atlas stood. For a heartbeat, the past returned. Bram trotted forward and nudged the lion's massive shoulder. Atlas lowered his head and gave a gentle huff. They stood there, pressed side by side, 2 creatures shaped by entirely different destinies, but bound by something older than instinct, something chosen. That night, Helen returned to the sanctuary well after the visitors had gone. She walked the outer path toward the observation rock, as she had done so many times before. There they were. Atlas sprawled beneath the moonlight, his mane catching silver strands of light. Bram lay beside him, smaller but steady, his head resting against the lion's flank. Helen didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She turned and left them to the night. In the stillness that followed, a breeze swept through the pines, lifting dry leaves into the air, like confetti from the forest itself, honoring not what had been lost, but what had been found. And in the hush between heartbeats, one truth lingered. Some friendships don't need explaining. They only need space to exist.